Welcome everyone to today's webinar on bridging community and data for climate action. Hi everyone, welcome today. My name is Kieran Maingot, Manager of Communities, Climate Transitions at Tamarack Institute. We are hosting this webinar in partnership with Climate Atlantic. Super grateful for that partnership and support in bringing everyone here today. I'm currently joining today as conversation from Jojage, Munyang, or otherwise colonially known as Montreal, the traditional territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us in this space and encourage everyone to get comfortable in ways that make sense to you as we go on this learning journey together. And I'm loving all the energy of folks introducing themselves in the chat and the lands that they're coming from. Keep it up and definitely let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to explore in the space today. So before getting on to kind of a little bit more about what we're going to chat about today, I'd love to reflect a little bit about sort of the topics of discussion today. So when we talk about community, when we talk about data, and when we talk about climate action, and really thinking about my presence here as a settler on stolen lands, I've been thinking about a couple of things. I've been thinking about how this discussion is somewhat rooted in colonial structures, myths, and tendencies. For one, I've been thinking a lot about how colonial paradigms of research and data and working have sometimes detached what we might call data from its very source, whether it be people, the land, or other living and non-living things. I think about how the question of bringing community and data together becomes necessary when data is sometimes collected, stored, and governed in ways that create distance from, community realities and the original source. Moreover, I think about the harm that's caused when data is extracted from communities and manipulated and applied in ways without the intentions of that source of that data in mind. I also think about how the community ownership and control of data, in particular in Indigenous context, is critical to the pursuit of sovereignty and self-determination. I also think about how many of the dominant paradigms of how we understand data are very deeply intertwined to both our historical and contemporary realities, and many of the practices that very much have furthered Canada's colonial project, from cartographically carving up Indigenous lands to using evidence to justify colonial intervention in the form of the child welfare system or the RCMP. At the same time, I really hope today's conversation can provide a few starting points for us to think about our role in repairing relations, supporting Indigenous self-determination and sovereignties, and dismantling harmful structures and practices around how we think about data, and especially that in the climate space. And I hope today can surface a little bit about how we as community-minded professionals and change makers can ensure our commitment to justice is carried through to how we use, relate to, and act upon data in our work. So now to move on to introducing today's topic a little bit. Today's conversation really comes, I think, at a really opportune time. It was actually born out of another conversation that we had in November of last year at our annual gathering for the Climate Transitions Network that really started to, I think, tackle a few questions around how we're using data in our climate work, and especially the question of data governance. And if you missed that conversation, my colleague Jamie will post it in the chat, and I would encourage you to watch the recording of that conversation. But in terms of that conversation, a few things came out that I think really are kind of centered in the conversation that we're having today. One of the things really being that, in all this talk about having data-driven and evidence-based decisions in our climate work from planning to implementation, there remains some uncertainty in practice about what this looks like, especially at the community level, and especially in the context of collaborations and when diverse actors are being brought together. And then second to that as well, when we talk about community engagement and community-led climate work, there seems to be a few tensions or just, lagging hesitancies around how to bring community into sometimes what is often called more technical work, where data is often found. And so I'm really elated today to be joined by Brittany and Emma, who will be offering both their experiences, expertise, and wisdom to sort of start to tackle a couple of these questions and myths and truths that are rooted in some of those themes that I think emerged from our November conversation. So now to just introduce today's speakers, and I'm probably going to not do it justice, and going to ask both Brittany and Emma to introduce themselves in their own right in a little bit. But I'm welcomed today by Brittany Cormier, who is Executive Director of EOS Eco Energy, in which she oversees projects focused on renewable energy, energy efficiency, green infrastructure, watershed monitoring, and climate change adaptation. Brittany has a very multidisciplinary and faceted educational and work background and experience implementing solutions on stormwater management, flood mitigation, shoreline stabilization, habitat connectivity, data management, and environmental policy. And then I will also today joined by Emma Poirier, who is the science and adaptation specialist at Climate Atlantic currently, and has a background in environmental science with an MSc in applied science from St. Mary's University, focused on coastal dynamics. And in her work, she's really focused on how to use data to understand our physical environment for climate adaptation, habitat ecology, and coastal restoration work. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Emma and Brittany to the floor and into this conversation. And we will get today's conversation started. Welcome, Emma and Brittany. Great to have you both here.
Hi, great to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for organizing this, Kieran, and thanks for the introductions. I'm thrilled to be here, and I've also been a huge fan of Emma, so I'm really thrilled to be here with you too.
I'm glad that we can all fan over each other.
Also been a fan of EOS's work.
Thank you.
Perfect.
It sometimes just takes events like these for virtual meetings.
Fantastic. So maybe to get us started, I'd love to just, like I said, get a little bit of an introduction to you both. And I would love to learn a little bit more about you, your work, and sort of where climate data sits in the work that you're currently tasked with, or that's really taking up a lot of your energies and focus. So maybe I'll start off with you, Brittany, and then we'll go to you, Emma.
Yeah, so I mean, you covered a lot in the introduction. Thank you so much. But I'm Brittany. Thank you so much for having me. So we do a lot as a nonprofit charitable organization. And I'm tuning in from the community of Sackville, New Brunswick right now, also known as Mi'kmaq, the unceded traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples. So renewable energy efficiency, climate change adaptation, and watershed monitoring, we do a lot of different pillars. And within all of our work, climate data is so integral and important. So we've been able to accomplish recently a few things that come to mind after learning more about what this space today was facilitated for. So I'm happy to say that we've just recently released a Health Adapt Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptive Capacity Report, looking at climate change impacts related to health in our local communities of Straight Shores and Tantramar, where climate data was used for the report, as well as health data, and used in action-oriented way to make recommendations for partners, whether that's the municipalities, nonprofits, individuals, households, and different facets of our community. We also use our we use flood risk mapping a lot, and it's very helpful in being able to focus our energies. Since in southeastern New Brunswick, we are extremely vulnerable to flooding. It's very helpful for our projects, whether it's climate change adaptation, whether it's our home flood risk assessments that we offer for homeowners, whether it's different projects that we're looking at on a bigger planning scale or smaller projects that we're looking at helping mitigate these vulnerabilities. It's an incredible asset. So yeah, those are just a few things, and I'll be happy to discuss further, but of course I would also like to pass the baton to Emma and not take up this whole meeting.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll begin with acknowledging that I am in Mi'kmaq, so on the shores of Jubuktuk, currently known as Halifax Harbor, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So I work with Climate Atlantic, and we are a climate service provider in Atlantic Canada. And for those of you, I see a lot of are outside of this this place, but we also have kind of partner organization throughout Canada. So we all work closely with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services and have very similar organizations throughout the country. And in essence, what we do is that we support people in Atlantic Canada with climate change adaptation. So my role specifically is as the climate change science and adaptation specialist. And that does involve things like sourcing data sets and facilitating access to them. So for example, helping people access and interpret future projections for their local areas. And so, yeah, climate data does quite fit in my work quite a bit. And that I help people find the data sets that can help them make decisions about adaptation, essentially. So that can be things like sea level rise projections. It could include like extreme heat projections, precipitation data, things like that. And I'll also say that a lot of the work that we do and focus on kind of emphasizes that climate data is just one portion of that decision making and adaptation, and there are a lot of other components and aspects that are taken into account and need to be kind of explored alongside the data. But the data does help with one of those components.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Brittany. It's great to hear a little bit more about your backgrounds. And I also love like the way that you both complement each other. I feel like you both have a lot of expertise in your own right, doing different types of work. And you started speaking a little bit to, I think, a few of your specific sort of projects or roles that I think you fill in the ecosystem. And I'd love with this next question to maybe dig a little bit deeper into that and get a little bit more of sense with maybe a practical example of how you or partners, maybe in your case, Emma, have like really thought about leveraging data for climate action, and really like in this case, like what moved the project to use data and why was its use of data like successful, and what are some things that people can be thinking about or taking away from this example to sort of get unstuck when we think about that question of data. So maybe to like flip-flop between you two, I'd love to maybe pass it back to you, Emma, if that's okay, and then we'll go to you, Brittany.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll say that a lot of the examples that we've worked with have been kind of around the education or building awareness kind of themes. And one example that I'll say is we've done a lot of community climate profiles with communities. And when I say climate profile, what I kind of mean is like a short summary of what the place is projected to look like in the future in terms of things like precipitation or temperature. So in these cases, we would determine with the community, what are the climate indices that are most important for the community, and then provide some kind of profiles or infographic type material that focus on those things that people are interested in, either that it could be some changes that the community is already seeing or maybe are worried about. And I think that, part of what makes sense or what maybe makes those things successful is that the fact that we're already experiencing some of those changes. So the projections might be showing like larger changes, but we're already seeing some of those. So that really helps people kind of understand or have more confidence in the data sets because we can see those changes on the ground. And then with some of these data sets, either with like the climate profiles or just data themselves, some other examples of actions that we've seen some of the people that we work with take. For example, we've worked with people in like health and education and supported them using temperature projections to make decisions about heating and cooling systems in healthcare facilities and climate control in their infrastructure. Another example that comes up is using sea level rise projections to inform land use planning in the coastal zone. And then one that I think is also relevant for communities is using the data to support funding proposals. So for example, communities applying for funding for any type of adaptation project, and using climate data to support their case of why adaptation is important. And similarly, like you can use it to advocate for services in a community to kind of support an argument that they need more of a certain infrastructure, like more outdoor flood resistant infrastructure, for example. Yeah, so I think that in general, we see kind of leveraging data as a tool to set the context of the situation, and having a better context of the issue at hand or the situation at hand can help us ultimately make better decisions. And I think that yeah, maybe to speak to the why these things, how to make these things successful is really focusing on the issues that people are seeing and focusing on the changes that that people, you know, have experiences with.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. I think that that was so many great sort of examples that you painted there of how I think data, and I think it comes back to kind of what you mentioned at the outset, that like data isn't everything, but it is a tool that you can use to move things forward and to speak a certain type almost of language that like is very influential in some circles and stuff, especially when we talk about I think the funding question, like we're always, you know, a lot of us are constantly thinking about how we can get the resources we need to do this work and stuff like that. And sometimes data can be a really helpful tool in moving the needle on that as well. And I think what really comes to mind for me, especially in relation to how we bring community and data together and stuff like that, is thinking about it as well, like how like the community is such a strong source of data as to why things need to happen, right? You know, when we are experiencing things already, like you say, like that is such a critical data point as to why this work is necessary. And so thinking about it, I think both in sort of a very quantitative way of like the existing data sets, but also thinking about, you know, when we talk about data as a tool that can move our priorities forward, how can we bring the community into that conversation and use the data points that are provided, maybe in a more sort of qualitative, but also could be quantitative way as well in moving those pieces forward. Before I go deeper maybe into that, I want to pass it over to you, Brittany, and hear a little bit more about maybe speaking to some of the examples in your introduction as to, you know, why those cases were particularly successful or what really sort of made the use of data in that point in those cases really effective.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think even going back to a few points that Emma brought up, like I'm thinking of similar things as well. Like we've been able to successfully use data to support funding proposals, and our partners have been able to leverage data to really get actionable items going and moving forward. Our Health Adapt report is one of our most recent successes, thanks to our professional consultant and planner, Tracy Wade. So definitely, this was an area that I really see as a leaping pad for us. Finally being able to anchor climate data and health data in an actionable item of recommendations, not only just for the municipality to do, not only just for nonprofits to do, but something that everybody could take away from and contribute to. As well, it's yeah, so we're looking forward to working on that. But it also makes me think, you know, in our local communities, we are coastal, extremely vulnerable to flooding, whether it's from the straight shores of Northumberland Straits to the Chignecto Isthmus, which is the little strip of land between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, which is extremely vulnerable to flooding and severing. And all the way to the village of Memramcook, a small Francophone community in southeastern New Brunswick we also work within. That's off of the Bay of Fundy. We get those tides, some of the highest in the world, twice a day, every day. So looking at climate data here is harrowing for us as well as our partners. And it's something that we don't have to convince our community that the climate crisis is here, it's present, and it's happening. But it has been helpful to see this data applied so clearly to help some larger efforts. So don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of work to do, but sharing some recent successes in my local community too. We've been able to see a newly amalgamated Tamarack here. So just completed 100,000 cubic meter storage stormwater retention ponds to mitigate inland flooding, looking at the climate data projections for southeastern New Brunswick, how precipitation is projected to change. Not only just sea level rise impacts and storm surges, but trying to brace and adapt for a bit of everything. For relatively small rural communities in New Brunswick, we've worked with Straight Shores, Tanchmar, and Memramcook, and our local partners to install green infrastructure, quite quickly and effectively, such as rain gardens, food forests, green roofs, some of the first in the province. And locally, there have been success in conserving, restoring, and creating wetlands. So using climate data to inform our own work in providing plans and action items, recommendations to local communities, and seeing the actionable items come into play has been a pleasure, but also is something that really moves us forward in knowing that there's so much to do, that we can't do it alone. And also as a community based group, we are nothing without our community. So making sure that these things are being done and that we're making sure that as many of partners and stakeholders locally are part of the conversation and nobody's getting left behind.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brittany, for that. I think that's such an important note to lead with, that you finished off in terms of making sure no one is left behind and stuff like that. I'm curious to sort of the examples that you just shared, Brittany, if you don't mind me asking a follow-up. I'm just curious, in sort of those projects, like what role did you see, I guess, the community playing in some of those projects that you were talking about? And what was sort of, when we talk about bringing community and data together, I think the project is one thing, but in terms of in the process, was there anything that I guess you or your team was thinking about in terms of helping make that sort of collaboration possible around that?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm relatively new to EOS, so I am also, sharing successes that some of which I had nothing to do with. But I'm inspired by, and I'm just really fortunate to be part of this community and be part of moving forward. So what has been successful in making sure the community is part of these? Some of these projects that I'm mentioning have come directly from community feedback and engagement and suggestions. So whether that's community consultation on plans that EOS has facilitated for local municipalities on climate change adaptation, or working with different collaboratives that we've been able to have a lot of partners and a lot of different specialists and a lot of different sectors in the same room together talking, which I know is incredible and difficult when everybody has different schedules. But we've also been working with the Chignecto Climate Change Collaborative, which is a combination of environmental specialists, emergency management staff, municipal, provincial, public representatives, MLAs, and municipal staff, all working towards identifying and engaging with the community and making actionable items and working on these actionable items, some of which have come up and we've been able to work on, which has been really great to kind of not just use all of the climate data that we easily have access to. And Climate Atlantic is part of this collaborative as well, which we are very grateful to have on board, but really coming at this from as many different perspectives and sides as we can, and making sure that we're all talking to each other. When I started working here, particularly in Sackville, it was something that was shared with me that there is no shortage of experts here, but there is an extreme lack of coordination. Everybody's doing such incredible projects and incredible things, but nobody's talking to each other, or the opportunities that we have, we need more of. So I think that EOS has been very successful at being that coordinator, being that networker, and being able to really leverage data experts and community knowledge and deep engagement in actionable items and projects that we've been able to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you for that additional color that you added to that. Really appreciate that, Brittany. I'd love to kind of transition into our next question, which I think is focused on some of what I'm seeing coming up in the chat in terms of some questions I think are really around sort of there's some questions around like the sort of Eurocentric colonial sort of definitions of data and paradigms of data that I think I started to allude to in my introduction, as well as questions around like how do you incorporate or honor Indigenous knowledge and sort of decolonize how we think about both data and use it and things like that. And so I'd love to work some of those questions into how we're thinking about this next question, which is really focused on sometimes these tensions that are placed between like Western science and like sort of data-driven approaches, and then more sort of grassroots community-led climate work that's like grounded in like local knowledges and things like that. I'm really curious to see like from your perspective in your work and just like sort of either what you've seen or what you've partnered with to see and stuff like that. How you see sort of data and community coming together and sort of what can help ease some of these tensions that I think we often see or we hear about and things like that, and what should maybe be questioned about sort of this dichotomy or this sort of tension-filled sort of dynamic that's created between sort of when we talk about community and data in sort of separate spheres of work and stuff like that. So yeah, would love to start maybe with you, Emma, and then we'll go to you, Brittany, if that's cool.
Sure. Yeah, and maybe I'll start by reflecting on that what should be questioned here, because I think that, you know, exploring some of these questions can help facilitate coming together, perhaps. So some of those questions that I think are always good to ask and think about include things like, who is this serving? Like, who is the action serving? What are the underlying assumptions with any sorts of data sets? What information has gone into these data sets and what information has not gone into them? And what other information is out there, and how can we kind of supplement them? And then the next step would be like, how can we blend other knowledge systems with Western science type data? And how can we look at different sets of information and use them together? And I think that, you know, one first step to this is really just talking together and sharing together. And so thinking about, you know, who is in the community that we're working in, and what are the community values, and then kind of looking at what knowledge systems are present in the community, and how can we blend them with those data driven approaches to ultimately, you know, make more informed decisions. So yeah, climate data and projections are one tool that we can use as a resource to help us in our decision making. But also important are the community values and the community knowledge. And those types of things are maybe what will help us figure out kind of what to do with the data, and what we want to, say, protect, or what we want to build resilience around. And I think that, you know, talking to people and seeing what are they seeing at the local level. So I think that we experience that, you know, people at the local level are really good at recognizing changes. So for example, like people will see that there's maybe less ice than there used to be. So we could then take that information and use Western data driven approaches to supplement that with projections of how ice will continue to change in the future. And we could take that same example, say, for like more intense rainfall events or sea level rise. So taking, you know, talking and sharing knowledge with people on the local level, and then helping distill like what people are seeing and whether or not those things are connected to climate change. And then if it is connected to climate change, then kind of like what are the processes why that's happening, and will it continue to change, and how can we adapt to that with keeping those community values in mind.
Thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate that. I think sort of one of the points that really came out for me is kind of resonating with something that one of my colleagues here at Tamarack has told me multiple times, and I actually don't know the original origins of who offered this phrase or saying, but there's no numbers without stories, and there's no stories without numbers, and it very much like speaks to sort of the way in which we really need to mesh like both the qualitative and the quantitative and really sort of reconnect in some ways. Like when we often think about data in a very sort of numbers or data sort of in a very quantified way, like it's really important to bring those back and sort of doing a little bit of a tethering process to make sure that we can make sense of them, but they can also be applied in ways that really honor the intentions of who either offered that data and what maybe their priorities are and stuff like that. So I really appreciate you kind of, yeah, reminding us, I think, about some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves when we're engaging with data, when we're engaging with community, and how, yeah, it's not just about, I think, asking ourselves like what would be helpful, but it's like what do the people who are directly impacted, what do the people who are offering this information to us actually want to be done with this? And so it comes back to that idea of self-determination. It comes back to that idea of, I think, being really in a process sense, really intentional of including folks in the decision making of where that goes and honoring their intentions and desires for this work and stuff like that. So before I get into, I feel like you said a lot of great things, and I would love to speak to all of them, but I'd love to hop over to you, Brittany, and maybe get your perspective on this question as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm absolutely just captivated listening to you both talk. And I'm like trying to jot down some quotes at the same time. I think that's a really beautiful that there are no numbers without stories or no stories without numbers. And in my experience in this, in the environmental nonprofit sector, I've definitely seen a gap between, a gap to bridge between community and science in general. Some people find scientific processes and the rigor of academia exclusionary, and not really capable of locally or integrating local knowledges. So I really appreciate this question. As a community-based charitable nonprofit, everything we do is for the community and with the community. And frankly, all of our projects come from some sort of community engagement. So we're nothing without local knowledges. But also working to undo this perspective, I think is really important. To whereas everything is connected, related, and more of a network of knowledge rather than segregated specialties and pockets of expertise. Some of our projects follow rigorous scientific methods of monitoring, such as our watershed monitoring projects, but are led and shaped by local knowledge, community members who are engaging with our work and also telling us where to work and what they would like to see and what they would like to know more about. And I also think that it's a beautiful future forward that we have in bringing community and data coming together. There are also incredible Indigenous-led conservation and restoration groups who prove every day that these don't need to be separate and are reshaping the way that data collection and management is conducted while grounded in local knowledges. I'm looking forward to, and I'm sorry I keep talking about watershed monitoring, but I'm so excited for field season. We're going to be working with the Indigenous-led organization, the Fort Folly Habitat Recovery, which I highly recommend to take a look at their work, who is looking at doing a project focused on scientific monitoring, but through the Indigenous calendar. And so starting in the frog croaking moon, I believe it is. And so while we're giving them some training for water quality monitoring, I'm really looking forward at hearing more about their projects moving forward. And so, yeah, I do think that the future is bright in the way that we can finally not just keep these two aspects separate of the community, of local knowledges and of data and a scientific lens.
Yeah. Brittany, we have a question from Jamie. Would you be able to repeat the name of that organization? I think she wants to try and link to it.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. You're so fast. So it's the Fort Folly Habitat Recovery in the First Nation of Emlumgog. Yeah, First Nation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess Yeah, I just want to say, like, I really, really appreciate you sharing those examples. And I think that example that you shared, Brittany, is such a great model of the way that's coming together, but also the way that your organization can enter that partnership and what it can offer in terms of supporting a partnership that is so based on, I think, a really good sort of practice around data that is very grounded in community values and community knowledges, and sort of local use and local control and things like that. But also at the same time, the way that you as an organization can offer expertise in maybe other areas, to support the processes and projects that they're working on and stuff like that. So really, really appreciated that example. I'd love to maybe jump into sort of our next question, which is specifically around tools. And I know we did have a question, I think, in the chat that was very much focused and interested around like different software or things that folks could use for analysis. And so I think it plays really well to this tool share question, which will just be really focused on, what tools have you used in your work that have been helpful, I think, in maintaining a practical and effective and community inclusive use of data in moving towards like your targets or working with partners and stuff like that. I can't even remember the order now of like where I am. So I'm just gonna start with you, Emma, because I feel like this is like your bread and butter. And then we'll move over to you, Brittany, if that's okay.
Yeah, there's lots of great tools out there. And maybe I'll focus on like two websites that have tools that we work with a lot, and that have the kind of exact purpose of making climate data accessible. And one of those is climatedata.ca. And so climatedata.ca is a website kind of hosted by the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, who we work with. And it has kind of locally relevant data sets in terms of there's a lot of future projections data, also historic data, but it also presents it in a relatively very practical way. You can kind of choose your location. You can choose which climate variables you want to look at, and then you can either look at it on interactive maps that shows you kind of spatial variation, or you can click on your location and it'll show you a graph of how the projections are projected to change through time, like throughout the century. So that's kind of our go-to resource for climate data that we recommend to a lot of communities. And not only is there like the data itself that you can either like save a map or a figure, or you can download it, and if you want to do an extra analysis, you can. There's also an analyze section where you can like put your own thresholds, like if you're looking for, say, like days above 32 degrees or something like that, you can do specific thresholds. And they have some really helpful sections, like they have a learning zone which has material on kind of like how to use climate data and questions that might come up as you're using it. And there's also sector specific sections, so like a health section and agriculture sections, which have kind of like the key variables that might be useful for that sector, but also have case studies. So it'll show like other organizations or communities which may have made use of them. So I think that's a very helpful tool. And then on our Climate Atlantic website, we also have a couple of tools. I'll mention a couple. Like we have a networking map, which is it's for Atlantic Canada, but it allows people who are working in adaptation to put a pin on the map, and then it allows others to have a look at who's available and maybe reach out to someone who has perhaps a specialty they're looking for. And we have an adaptation library with resources to kind of like reports, videos, things like that on adaptation. And we also have a coastal adaptation toolkit that is specifically for sorting out adaptation options for coastal flooding and erosion issues. So those are those are a couple tools that that we make use of a lot, and I really aim to be practical.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. I feel like I feel like my colleague Jamie is working extra hard to make sure all of those things are added in the chat. So folks, just a reminder, we will be sending out our email with all of the links and stuff like that after the session. So no worries if you're not able to get all of those nuggets of wisdom that were just offered down too quickly. I also wanted to take a quick second to remind folks that they can drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A function. I know we have a couple, and I'm excited to get to them after this question, but I will now pass it over to you, Brittany, to maybe offer a tool or two before we head into some audience questions.
Definitely Emma's bread and butter. So I don't have too much more to contribute, since we are actually the beneficiaries of all of this data and all of these tools that Climate Atlantic use and develop, since we use all of these tools that were just referenced. And we also use climatedata.ca, which is really helpful. I mean, you could go back to the framework and software if you're doing your own data analysis of RStudio, and QGIS, depending on your project. But why recreate the wheel when I'm sure there are local resources and tools available to you? I'm, of course, much more familiar with those in Atlantic Canada. So this is just what we've been working with and what we've been able to use successfully. But I would also echo that infographics have been such a great tool as a visual way of really making the data accessible and palatable, breaking down barriers of people who might be a little bit, well, intimidated by numbers, one. Two, also not really that data familiar. So I think that they are such an incredible tool. I have an infographic of sea level rise here in Atlantic Canada to remind me, not every day, but of the ways that you can really break something very complex down visually that can be really effective in explaining to a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different kind of communities. Tabletop models have also been really helpful for us, and something that has come up in our consultations with emergency management staff for extreme weather events. So we can see that climate data as a vulnerability for a region, but in a space that we can kind of make it more malleable and see what kind of ways that we can increase the resiliency and the strategies of taking action on it. So yeah, ways that you can really bring it into different realms. But infographics, Canva, use Canva a lot. And in the future, we are looking at getting a bit more expertise on our staff in QGIS and R and RStudio as the more accessible softwares. So yeah, those would be my recommendations. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Brittany. Really appreciate that. We have some great questions from folks in the audience, and I'm going to start working our way through them. But just to quickly plug a resource that I know one of my colleagues, Laura, shared in the chat a little bit earlier in our conversation today. I had the pleasure of speaking to some folks from the Canoe team last week, and they shared a resource called Healthy Plan City, which is sort of a visual mapping software that was created, I think, late last year. And it really sort of maps a bunch of different indicators on, I think, 125 municipalities in Canada. They tend to be a little bit larger, a little bit more city focused. So if you're in one of those regions, it could be something really interesting to look at because it maps both health, climate, and vulnerability and sort of inequality indicators on top of each other. So it's a really, I think, great resource for thinking through some climate justice and climate equity related questions in sort of our planning. But for now, I'd love to jump into sort of some of the questions that are coming up for our audience. I see a first question from Rebecca around what kinds of data have folks found have been most effective when speaking to political powers, whether that's at the local, regional, or national level. So I'll welcome either of you to jump in on that question yeah, take it away.
Yeah, maybe what I can say to this question, and it's I think that people really remember or learn based on events that happen to them. So I think that kind of using extreme events that happened, like we had Hurricane Fiona a couple of years ago, that caused a lot of damage, and that was a very memorable and tragic event. And so, and there have been others like wildfires and flooding. And I think that kind of putting those into context of what we are, projected to experience and how we're projected to have more intense storms and experience those conditions more and more helps maybe put politicians understand what that might look like.
Yeah, and I would, sorry, Kieran.
No, go. I was going to ask you, Brittany.
Yeah, no, I would definitely echo that. That has been very helpful, especially if you're working with provincial or municipal representatives who might not be as familiar with climate data. They can certainly see the climate crisis, especially in Atlantic Canada. Everybody knows somebody, whether it's across New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, who have been directly impacted by something that has come up, such as Hurricane Fiona, the wildfires across Tantallon and New Brunswick last summer, the extreme flooding in our areas. While we were doing home flood risk assessments in our local communities, we had some houses that are experiencing flooding on a continual basis, and they are fighting rivers in their basements every spring and fall. So it's not that we don't understand what's happening because of this, or that we can really see what the climate data is showing us. And every meeting that I've had, whether it's with municipal partners or provincial partners, locally cross-country skiing is really popular. So it's been a lamenting of this winter and how the snow is changing and how everything's kind of changing, that you can really use and make the climate data a little bit more palatable and the projections a little bit more real of, yeah, no, you are experiencing it, and this is kind of how we can help you move forward, because we have all of this and all of these resources and projections, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's changes in precipitation, whether it's the increasing of extreme heat events, and actually planning for seeing human health as something that we need to do in climate change adaptation planning, and really anchoring the human experience in this climate crisis as well. So that's been helpful in my experience, working with government representatives, whether that's municipal, provincial, and I had the pleasure of going to the Sustainable Communities Conference in Ottawa. I think that was 2022 or 2023. I can't remember it now. But I really appreciated, there was a representative from the Yukon who, after a few different sessions, she just took a moment and drew our attention to an extreme landslide in her local community. And just on a topic of talking about climate data, just the whole room went silent and just reminded us all of, what we're facing and what we're going up against. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I think we'll have time for maybe one more question from folks before we probably have to start wrapping up. I don't know where the hour went, but I see one question from Gloria that I really love that just came in, and I'd love to maybe tackle that one. And they ask, what are some specific examples of effective methods of gathering community knowledge and needs? And what kind of roles can nonprofit organizations that don't work directly with climate play in that? So I'm curious if either of you have thoughts.
I can start with just mentioning a few things. I think that effective methods of gathering community knowledge or needs, I think kind of meeting people where they're at. So if there are already maybe some gatherings happening in the community, maybe trying to participate in those to learn more and kind of understand the needs more. And then in terms of, what kind of role can nonprofits play, even if they don't work directly with climate, I think that we can kind of put a climate lens onto a lot of things. And if you're planning any projects for the future, if you any kind of programming or projects that you had, you can kind of reflect on how what you can do in those projects that might bring climate into play, either on the mitigation or adaptation side. But with adaptation, it could be like looking at if there is any future planning projects, kind of looking at how it could be maybe implemented in a way that takes into consideration a bit of a climate lens, and working with others as well.
And I can go from there. Working with others is definitely something that I was going to bring forward. And while it's really effective to host your own community engagement gatherings, it's definitely stronger together, and to be able to get different perspectives and create a space where you listen and learn from not just a few, but many, looking and identifying different partners who don't have the same perspectives as you, and who might not have been part of the conversation before, is really important. I've never actually worked with people from health departments or long-term family doctors until our health adapt community consultations, and hearing their opinions and their recommendations on how to move forward in the climate crisis was really just eye-opening. We also try to work with or attend different municipal council meetings. So municipalities usually have a good catchment of a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different public members who might not participate in different kind of events, also different ways of engaging people safely, such as virtual events still, and maybe in person, meeting people where they're at. Yeah, definitely as well. Yeah.
That's a great thing to end on, meeting people where they are at. So important to remember and think about what that looks like in your local context for sure. I'd love to end with some parting words from both of you folks. Like if there's one piece of advice that you'd like to give someone or a group of folks or an organization, municipality who are wanting to be more data informed or think about how to use data in their work, and kind of are unsure of where to begin, what would you recommend they start by doing? And so, yeah, maybe we'll start with you, Brittany, and then we'll go to you, Emma, and then I'll close us off.
Reach out to your local nonprofit environmental organizations. There are data nerds out there and data specialists who just want some of your time to share knowledge. And I mean, working with the environmental nonprofit sector, it's just been a great way of networking and really finding that sweet spot between the community and data personally. So that would be my recommendation. My second recommendation and parting words would be to check out Climate Atlantic and all of their tools. So I'll pass that on to Emma.
Please reach out to us if you're in Atlantic Canada, or to some of the other partner organizations, because we are here to help. But maybe what I'll say is, you can start with a pilot project, and if you're not totally sure, you can start small and adapt as you go. You can kind of, adaptation is kind of well, adaptive management, I'll say, is an important part of it. So even if you start with one action, it might work really well, or you might need to reassess, but every iteration you kind of learn new lessons and you can apply it to the next one. So start and build from there and learn along the way.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'd like to maybe leave everyone with something as well. I think we did started to tackle some questions around how do we honor the intentions of, when community is giving us data, how do we think about how we're working with that data? How do we honor self-determination? How do we think about data, especially in the context of a colonial stolen land project that is Canada and things like that? I am familiar with the First Nations OCAP training. I'm not sure if folks have taken it, but I think it's another great resource for folks to start to sort of piece together and think about some questions around ownership, control, and the possession, and working with First Nations communities in particular and stuff like that. So I would encourage folks to check that out. I know we didn't get to some folks' questions, so deeply sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but I would encourage our speakers, if folks would like to get connected with you, if you want to share some way that folks can get connected with you in the chat, and maybe they can follow up with questions, as I know there was lots of curiosities with the projects and things that you shared. I would encourage you to do that. But in the meantime, my colleague Jamie has shared a feedback survey in the chat as well. We'd love to hear some feedback on how today's session went, what maybe you'd like to see in the future and things like that, and just anything else that we can be thinking about as we're hosting these spaces. And in addition, we do have an upcoming webinar on April 17th that will be focused a little bit more around how community and municipal collaborations can be thinking about emergency preparedness planning, especially around extreme weather and things like that. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And the link to register is in the chat as well. But yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to Emma and Brittany for joining me in the conversation today, and all of you for staying for the hour-long conversation. And we'll definitely follow up with all the resources and recording in due time as well. So gratitude to you all, and hope everyone has a good rest of their Wednesdays.